hopefully, if you were here last time as well, we can pick up on some of those questions that we're asking about what is creativity in this context. And we'll be really interested to see how all of the different workshops sort of speak to each other. So welcome if this is the first time that you've come and you weren't here last time, but it'd be really great to see how this develops over the course of, how many workshops have we got, Lucy? Is it 5 altogether?
Yeah, 5.
Yeah. So I'll hand over to Lucy, who will just give us a sense of what the sort of agenda is for today, and also introduce our first speaker.
Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about gendering and queering the creative classroom, and we've got 4 great papers on that topic. Just to sort of let you know, I've put in the chat function a list of future events that you can sign up for, and other topic areas. If you want to keep your camera on, then feel free to. It can be nice for people to see people whilst they're giving their paper. But otherwise, it just leads me to invite Sam Caslin, who is talking to us from the University of Liverpool. Sam is a senior lecturer in sort of gender and women's history, and she's written on sex workers in Liverpool, but also Britain more broadly. Sam, I don't know if you want to upload your slides. Hopefully it's working.
Yep, so I think the slides are just uploading.
They're probably doing that like fizzy thing, like.
Worked a second ago.
Yeah, it did.
We've seen them. Okay. It's telling me it's doing it.
They're coming up.
Brilliant.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your patience. So in this presentation, I want to focus on my work developing and teaching a module called Beyond Binaries, A Modern British History of Gender and Sexuality, which is a 30 credit second year undergraduate module in the Department of History at the University of Liverpool. The module focuses on Britain since the late 19th century, and it introduces students to historical experiences of gender diversity, to the evolution of dominant codes about gender and heteronormativity, and to the experiences of people whose sexualities were marginalised, stigmatised, and criminalised. Students, many of the students on the module won't have done any kind of history of sexuality before, and while they may have encountered cultural approaches to historical subjectivities and identities before doing this module, for the vast majority, the types of approaches that we take will be very new. And thinking about who would be likely to take this module and why they would be likely to take this module was crucial in developing assessments that I hope disrupt traditional assessment practices and also hierarchies in the way we pitch skills to students. Certainly, creative assignments can have an instrumental benefit in enhancing employability skills, which universities love to talk about. But I also want to suggest that creative assignments can empower students to take unanticipated and valuable insights from their work. So the module is assessed partly via an initial mini essay, which is worth 20% of the overall module mark, and that's due in the first few weeks. That's all fairly standard. It's just giving them a chance to get used to doing written work and getting some feedback on written work. But the first of the creative components is due in around the halfway mark through the module, and this is a solo produced video or podcast of between 5.5 and 7 minutes in length, and it's worth 30% of the module mark, although that is something that's under review, I think we might increase how much it's worth. For their final assessment on the module, the students do a 3,000 word written piece, and that's worth 50%. They have two options here. They can do a standard academic essay, or they can do a combined creative piece and a reflective commentary on that piece. And that was developed specifically in response to students who were really into creative writing and had real skills there and came to me and said, I really want to use this. I want to be assessed in this way. Now, although on the surface, these assessments seem to be about simply diversifying the range of skills assessed as part of a standard history module, I want to suggest that these assessments are just as much about inclusivity and empowerment for the students. These assessments have been directly informed by my reading of queer pedagogy, as well as feminist praxis and intersectionality. Writing about LGBT+ inclusive teaching, Ashley Moore notes that if we can assume that some of the students in any given classroom will be queer identifying or questioning, or have queer loved ones, acquaintances and co-workers, it seems logical that such themes will naturally arise as students talk or write about their lives. And this also applies to the way students talk and write about history, and to their understandings of how gender and LGBT+ histories must take account of broader axes of experience, such as experiences of race, class, age. Many of the students who opt to take Beyond Binaries do so because they identify as part of the LGBT+ community, or they have a close relationship with somebody who identifies as part of the community. And this means that it's really crucial that the module creates room for what Fraser and Lamble have referred to as non-normative educational desires and critical and transformative learning. So this involves recognising that students might seek to gain knowledge and skills from learning, which can be deeply personal and not easily quantifiable. Now, I don't expect you to try and look at this entire rubric, but it's there just for illustrative purposes. For these creative assessments, I did develop bespoke assessment rubrics. Making sure that the students had access to these rubrics as early as possible was particularly important, because as I'm sure you're all aware, when you introduce new or creative assignments, it can heighten student anxiety because they don't have experience doing these things. With the video or podcast, I say video or podcast, no student yet has opted to do an audio only podcast, so I'm quite video centric in the way I'm talking about this. But with that particular rubric, that is something that we need to go through in a seminar with the students. You can't just kind of throw all this information at them and expect them to make sense of it on their own. The rubric also aims to ensure that the students have a good sense of what kind of technical skills they'll be expected to develop as part of producing a video. And it's important that I also highlight to students that even though this is broken down into 3 sections, we've got content, support and evidence, and technical presentation, they're not weighted equally. It's more of a guide for the marker, and that the one that I suppose is most crucial really is content. You can have a really slick video, but if it's full of inaccuracies, that's going to significantly affect the mark, much more so than if it's a really great piece in terms of its content, but some of the technical presentation could be more elevated. Before the students complete that particular assignment, I run a video editing class with them. So I introduce them to free software like Windows Video Editor and iMovie in that workshop. I also, during the pandemic, I tried to model some of the video editing techniques through the recorded lectures that we were using. Now that we're back face to face, I'm using an old video from when I was first learning to use iMovie. I put together an advert for the module, and there, on one of the earlier slides, there is a link to that. It's on YouTube. So I get them to critique my initial efforts at trying to use iMovie. Again, just to give them a sense of what's expected. Now, the final assessment on the module, this is the one where students can opt to write the standard essay, or they can submit a creative piece. If they choose the creative piece, then that's split. So 1,500 words is a piece of creative writing, which includes footnotes if they want to put little asides in about sources of inspiration and things like that. And they also write a 1,500 word reflective commentary, which excludes footnotes because that's more like a standard academic essay. And in my department, the policy is not to include footnotes in the word count. I help students navigate this task by providing them with an FAQ. So you can see some examples on the screen of the types of questions they typically ask. You know, why were footnotes included? Does it have to be a complete story? And that sort of thing. And again, there's also a rubric for that, which is broken down into 2 sections. So one for the creative writing section and one for the reflective commentary. Each portion of that assignment has an overall weighting, an equal weighting on the overall module mark. Engaging creatively with topics encourages students to think more about subjectivity and historical change, in my experience. As part of the module, students study the 1920s case of Colonel Victor Barker, who was assigned female at birth and who was prosecuted for perjury for falsely signing a marriage register after getting married to a woman. And much of the historiography has made sense of Barker as a lesbian who disguised herself as a woman in order to, as a man in order to hide her relationships with other women. However, as James Vernon argues, Barker disrupted essentialist definitions of gender and sexuality by demonstrating their failure to encompass his life as a man. One student on the module used a fictitious monologue to explore how Barker's story represents a queer history that involved living outside of accepted social and sexual categories. The student used their monologue to explore Barker's sense of dislocation, and rather than attempting to fix this or fit Barker into a neat category, instead, the student argued that accepting Barker's unknowability was key to understanding their place in LGBT+ history. In doing so, the student drew upon writers like Leslie Feinberg to explain some of the fictitious words that they put into Barker's mouth in the creative piece. So the student explained, "I decided to include the quote by Leslie Feinberg from Stone Butch Blues. I didn't want to be different, but amended it to present tense. I wanted to highlight how conflictive and painful it can be not to fit into the categories available to you. Stone Butch Blues also expresses a position between male and female, which is something I wanted to focus on in the creative piece, rather than attempt to label Barker with my own 21st century projection and language." As part of their reflective commentaries, students are asked to reflect upon notions like authenticity and accuracy as well. For example, one student who was particularly interested in intersections between gender, class, and heteronormativity wrote a creative piece from the point of view of an object on the shelf during the 1984-85 miners' strike. And they used this piece to explore the gender dynamics of the domestic sphere in that context. Reflecting on the creative choices that they made, the students argued, taking a creative approach when analysing history allows for the deep exploration of the complications of the past, with personal experience being a focal point. Academic history often situates events as they pertain to a theme or meta-narrative, but representing history through a creative lens based on historical detail highlights individual emotions that are a driving force in history that can be overlooked. The aim for such creative work should be to be a resource with open-ended application instead of a set of mirror images of the past. So creative liberties that inspire emotional resonance are crucial. So these assignments have practical application, they have employability skills, they can talk about all these things that they can do. As one student commented in the module feedback, I thought the assessments were good as they tested different aspects of learning and abilities. But in my own judgment, I think these assessments are also empowering students to think more about what constitutes history, to think about areas like the history of emotions, and to think about queer antecedents of contemporary experiences. So I know we've only got 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there for now. And if anyone has any questions, we can come back to that.
So we've left a couple of minutes after each paper so that people can ask questions if they'd like to. We'll also have an opportunity to open the floor up for wider questions as well at the end of the session. But does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Sam? Oh, yep, I can see a hand. And Juliet.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Sam. It was just a question really about your final assessment. Did you have students using the practice-based alternative with the reflective piece? And if you did have, what sort of examples did they use?
So with the final piece, the option was, the standard academic essay, which was basically just a list of essay questions relating to lectures on the module that they could do. I would say the vast majority still ended up picking that standard option. So it's still the case that I think a lot of students are quite nervous about picking something quite creative. That said, there is a significant minority of students who are interested in doing this. So what you saw just then partly were extracts from the reflective commentaries. So those quotes from the students were taken from their work from that portion. But alongside that, they also submitted creative pieces as well, which were 1,500 words long. So we saw the actual piece from the students who'd written about the miners' strike from the point of view of it was a toy on a shelf and seeing the family like struggling with the money, and the students have put all kinds of detail in about like where the toy was from and how that fed into kind of regionalism and all kinds of stuff that they'd really pulled out. And the same with the Victor Barker monologue as well. That was kind of an internal monologue as Victor Barker was in the courtroom being prosecuted. So you see the sort of practical application in terms of like them doing something creative and having to justify the choices they make. They have to, in the reflective commentary, talk about the type of language they use. If they're going to use anything that might be a little bit anachronistic, they have to justify that. And so the most successful ones are the ones where the students really do try to marry together some sense of historical accuracy with invention too, where the students have really reflected on the need to be accurate too, and have justifications for when it's okay to deviate from that. So yeah, I suppose that they're the kind of practical applications, writing in different formats, in following different sets of instructions, all of those kind of employability skills. But I think the creative side of it really does help them approach these things in a different way and get different things from the history that I don't think we necessarily always emphasize when we talk about skills in modules. Like so many of the skills, it's about using footnotes, using evidence and all of this, but that can be such a creative process too.
Thank you very much.
Justin.
Thanks. I adore these assessments and projects, Sam. This sounds so interesting, and it's obviously really successful based on the really sophisticated engagement and reflection that your students are demonstrating. It's really exciting. I'd love to see the rubrics. I'd love to see all of these things in more detail.
I'm happy to send them to you.
Please do, definitely. My question is maybe more boring and practical though than the exciting assessments that you've created. So having been trained and studied in Canada and the States myself, we have a lot more freedom to change up assessments and include smaller assessments. And something I've really struggled with in the UK is a difficulty in integrating new types of assessment, but especially smaller summative assessments throughout the term, in part because of the need for either moderation or second marking. So the practicality of achieving that, and also the real social pressure against creating extra work for colleagues, requiring that moderation and second marking, I think is a real disincentive, at least in my department, for doing anything beyond standard research essay, 100%, or maybe there's a few of us radicals that do a second assessment in my department. I'm wondering how you've navigated those, or if your department gives dispensations for smaller assessments, and then just the issue of moderation and second marking for creative assessments.
Yeah, So I think one of the things that was really crucial for this was that it was a 30 credit module. So in my department, the standard size of a module would be 15 credits. So this is effectively a double weighted module, which means that you can kind of focus your attention on it a little bit more. And even with that, there's only really 3 assessments on it. You've got the mini essay, you've got the video or podcast, and then this final assignment. And I found that the students tend to prefer that rather than having lots and lots of smaller assignments, but that's just my experience. It does take a huge amount of work to get a creative assignment off the ground. And it's not always going to be possible due to workload demands. I think that's one of the pressures that's on us, that, you know, we're constantly striving to develop innovative assessments, but then when are we ever given the space to actually do that? So for me, it was really a case of wanting to do this, sitting down over the course of a summer and developing the rubrics. I started with the rubrics to think through, how would this work? How would it look? We've got an education department at the University of Liverpool who agreed to look at the rubric for me as well. So they didn't develop the rubric, but they can give you some feedback on it and things like that, which is so helpful. And then I'm at a point now where I can share it with colleagues at my institution or at other institutions. I think a big part of it is trying to work together and share knowledge and experience, what works and what doesn't work. Thankfully, I'm also in a department where other colleagues are starting to embrace these kinds of assessments too. So I'm not the only person in my department who does a creative writing assessment. So I can chat with colleagues about how they're finding it works on their modules. So having departmental support, again, is really crucial. And yeah, just having conversations with other people and sharing ideas, that goes some way to mitigate the amount of work involved in this. But there's no getting around the fact that if you're moving away from essay or exam, it's going to take work.
Thanks, Sam.
So I'm going to use Chair's prerogative and say, Kath, can you park your question? I think we should now move on to our next paper with Laura and Rosie. If you can set up your PowerPoint slides. And Kath is going to introduce you.
We're just setting up the slides now, so
Great.
hopefully they'll start appearing. It says it's doing something, so
It is doing something, and I can see it on the screen. So that's great. So I'm really happy to introduce Laura Harrison and Rose Wallace from the University of the West of England in Bristol. They've helpfully put that on the slide for us. But I know that if you've been teaching module together, haven't you? Or you've been, yeah. So
yes.
This is really the sense of a collaborative module. You've probably had loads of conversations about this, so it's really great to think about how we can learn from your discussions and your module teaching. Great, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Kat. Just to add, this is probably entirely my fault for getting the wrong end of the stick, but we've prepared for about 20 minutes.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Is that okay?
It is a 20-minute paper. Yeah.
No, phew, we just had kind of came out in a cold sweat then, but no, that's...
No, don't worry about it. When you submitted, you said if you wanted to do 20 or 10. And you said 20.
Oh, good. We're sort of getting the red pens ready to start like cutting out on the fly, but that's brilliant. So great. So yeah, we wanted to speak today a little bit about a module that we introduced for September 2020. So brilliant time to be introducing a new module. It's a second year module on gender and sexuality in modern Britain. And it is an optional module like Sam's, where we examine the sort of controversies and changing experiences of gender and sexuality in Britain in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. And we kind of explore protest movements, legislative change, alongside sort of broader social trends and developments. And what we really hope to do is to provide students with a sort of knowledge and understanding both of the history and of the historiography of gender and sexuality in modern Britain. So we introduce the module with a sort of, well, we try to, with an explicit focus on inclusivity in the content, in the learning outcomes, and in the assessment approach. And sort of throughout the module, gender, sexuality, class, and race as sort of intersectional categories are integrated into our workshop discussions, our readings, and into the assessment brief. What we're hoping to reflect on today, just for sake of time, is the space that we've tried to create in the module for students to obviously engage imaginatively and creatively with history, but with a particular focus on what we've called the sort of classroom community, as well as the module assessment. So students on the module, we hope, are really sort of supported, similar to much of what Sam was saying, to be these kind of active participants in the classroom and to draw on their own experiences and interests. And in both the kind of formal module feedback and more informal discussions, our students have reported feeling particularly engaged with the course content, the kind of overall ethos and approach of the module, and the work that they've actually created as part of the module assessment. So for the assessment, students create a public-facing piece of original historical research, which critically engages with one of the themes of the module. And this is a theme that they choose, and it's kind of relevant and meaningful to them. So over the past 2 years that the module has been running, it's included a whole range of different projects. We've had a short story based on working class women's letters to Marie Stopes. We've had school resources on changing attitudes towards contraception in the 20th century. We've had a painting and reimagining of Sarah Bartman, who was known in the 19th century as the Hottentot Venus. A diorama and exhibition plan for a museum display based on research into the relationships between African-American GIs and white working class women during the Second World War, a blog on Edward Carpenter and his 1908 work, The Intermediate Sex, an article for Spare Rib on consciousness raising groups, and a case study of the Bristol Female Penitentiary. And we're going to talk through some of those examples in more detail at the end of our talk.
So we thought we'd start, oh, Laura, can you do the, yeah, sorry, slick, guys. We thought we'd start with a focus on our classroom community. So the module is taught through a series of 2-hour weekly workshop sessions supported with pre-recorded lectures and online resources providing an overview of each topic. The workshops are dedicated to discussion and debate and are used to develop understandings of materials and topics collectively. So although we take it in turns to lead workshops and we've developed the materials and resources for some of the topics individually based on our own research interests, we both attend each workshop and genuinely co-teach these sessions. So students engage with, as we perhaps expect, a broad range of relevant secondary literature, but the focus of the module is on the wide variety of primary materials that students are given the opportunity to discover and interpret and utilise. Everything from campaign literature, oral histories, social surveys, film, and a wide range of digital resources, which is one of, perhaps, dare I say it, the benefits of first teaching the module in September 2020, when absolutely everything was online. So, for example, in one of our early workshops on marriage, family and sexuality, students are directed to the Women's Cooperative Guild Maternity Collection and asked to select one letter to bring along to the workshop and discuss with the rest of the group. In another workshop, students discuss images from the Royal Geographic Institute and Royal Anthropological Institute to explore the interconnections between gender, sexuality and race in the Imperial Project. We utilise family history research materials to examine experiences of unmarried motherhood in the mid-20th century, and the British Library and Mass Observation Observing the 80s collection of oral history interviews in our workshop session on the AIDS crisis, section 28, and the broader context of gender politics in the 1980s. We also explore film, public history projects and museum interpretation to consider how historical research has been reproduced for public audiences and the ramifications of its uses in the present. So on the slide here, this is relates to one of the examples that certainly generates plenty of discussion and debate, in workshops, which is a virtual tour of the Jack the Ripper Museum in Whitechapel in London. So we reflect on the museum's interpretation in comparison to the approaches and evidence we've encountered in the readings and primary material discussed in the workshop to explore how else we might tell the stories of the women killed in Whitechapel in 1888. We use coroner's inquest reports to think about the women's families, work and relationships and how their acquaintance perceived them, and to critique the narratives communicated by the museum. There's always a particularly explosive moment around what one hopes is inadvertent victim blaming. I've nobbled them on the slide there, that really sharpens discussion around our responsibilities and the consequences of the historical stories we choose to tell and how we tell them.
So drawing on the Royal Historical Society's 2018 Race, Ethnicity and Equality in UK History report and Melissa Ono-George's work on anti-racist pedagogy in British history classrooms, students on the module are encouraged and supported to be active participants in the classroom community. Their individual experiences and contributions are respected and valued. And we try to sort of foster that environment by firstly being explicit with students about the pedagogy that we're employing in the classroom and really emphasising the importance of open and respectful discussions. So one way we do this is by using a pre-module survey that students complete at the end of our introductory session. That is, of course, inspired by Lucy's use of that format in her own teaching. So thank you, Lucy, for sharing so much of your work with us all on Twitter and your blog. So students are kind of asked to think about why they decided to take the module, again, kind of resonating with some of what Sam was saying earlier, what they hope to get out of it, and thinking about particular topics or themes they would like us to touch upon and discuss. We also spend some time in that session thinking about what students believe they need to do to get the most out of the module and what role they would like us as the teaching team to play, as well as what they would like their peers to do in the classroom. So that includes a discussion of the workshop environment as this open and discursive space. We all agree in the session that it's important for everyone to be respectful, as well as to kind of negotiate engagement, you know, not to joke about serious subjects, for example. And that while students are encouraged to engage with the themes of the module that are meaningful to them, that there isn't an expectation or requirement that they have to share any personal experiences. But if they would like to, and if they do, that other students in the group need to respect that, and we need to sort of treat some of those discussions in confidence.
And we also include content notes for lectures, readings and workshop materials for when they touch on things like sexual violence or they include prejudicial language. And we make it clear to students that they can negotiate their engagement if they're affected by any of the module content. And again, this has been commented on favourably by students and supports the establishment of an open and respectful discursive space. So in these sessions, students are really asked to employ critical thinking skills and reflect on their own social positions. And we regularly utilise collaborative small group and active learning based around primary evidence to facilitate this. Students are encouraged to draw on their own experiences and apply what they've learned to their wider communities and lives. And we feel this provides a deeper learning experience which allows students to learn from one another and can also enhance communication between students of diverse backgrounds. This approach has encouraged collaborative learning amongst students, and the division between us as lecturers, as authoritative experts maybe, and students as learner is minimised, developing students' confidence as autonomous and critical learners. We genuinely find teaching this way really exciting and inspiring, and students report feeling particularly engaged with the module as well.
Yep, so now on to, I think you probably sensed that enthusiasm coming through, hopefully. But we thought we'd talk a little bit now about the assessment as well. So as I mentioned earlier, students are supported to create a public-facing piece of historical research, which critically engages with a theme of the module that's relevant and resonates with them. So why we've selected this is the primary purpose is really to allow students to kind of research and present a quite detailed piece of work on the history of gender or sexuality, or both, in modern Britain. And the key element is that the presentation can take any form as long as it's not a conventional essay. And when we first taught the module, we'd sort of come up with some ideas and themes, bearing in mind that a lot of students feel kind of intimidated by that approach. So we'd sort of said, oh, you know, you could do a poster, a blog, a podcast. And basically, as we discovered, the students are far more creative and imaginative than we are, and sort of took those ideas and really ran with them. This project is also accompanied, though, by a 1,500 word justification, which I guess is our word for critical reflection. So it's where they contextualise and situate their project within the kind of primary and secondary source base. And students are also encouraged to think about what is the most appropriate form in which to present their research. So it might be that the research itself, or that the form have some kind of personal relevance for them. So to give you an example, one student who had plans to become a history teacher designed a pack of school resources based on their research into the history of contraception. And another student created a programme for a musical inspired by their kind of passion for musical theatre. And this was based on their research into the personal story of Leon Lomax, who was a child born of a relationship between an African-American GI and a British woman who went on to be adopted in the US by his father and his father's wife.
So whichever form the students choose, it is the depth and originality of their research that remains the central concern. I think this, again, sort of touches on what Sam was saying about content as the priority. This isn't a beauty contest. So their project should be grounded firmly in primary material and supported by wider relevant secondary reading. Students are asked to aim for originality, and Laura will talk about that a bit more in a moment, but that's really telling us what they think from their reading of the evidence and thinking of their research as a contribution to knowledge on their chosen topic. The justification that comes with it gives students the space to contextualise their project, identifying their primary sources and secondary reading, reflecting on key terms and ideas, and discussing the content and presentation and intended audience of their project. So it's really about them getting to show off all the amazing work that they've done to underpin the creative output. We have workshop time every week devoted to the discussion of their project ideas, and for every weekly session we give students a range of kind of potential research themes and ideas to explore, although, you know, as we've already intimated, they go way beyond these. We have 1 week of class time specifically for one-to-one tutorials to discuss ideas, and we found this is a really good way of kind of getting them to think about how you'd work with a dissertation supervisor, which is what they'll be doing in their third year. Students are also given an opportunity to informally present their final project ideas to the rest of the workshop group. And this year, as a kind of enhancement, we hope, to the module, our students will also be able to receive support from our creative project technician, Miranda Harris. Miranda is a writer, illustrator and bookmaker who draws on her cross-disciplinary skills and practice to work with our students, not just on the history programme, but in creative writing and English as well, to help them kind of frame and form their creative projects.
So I know it sounds like we are asking a lot of our students, and we are, but honestly, they have really risen and respond to the challenge and enjoy that kind of opportunity to be creative. Students who might not always do that well in written essays and exams are able to sort of demonstrate their learning and engagement with the themes of the module in lots of different ways. But of course, as again already touched on by Sam, one of the biggest challenges is how do you assess this? How do we kind of ensure parity? You know, bearing in mind that we're encouraging students to have very different approaches to the assessment brief. And this now touches on something that Justin mentioned in his question. So the creative assignment was something that I'd first used in my teaching in 2015 when I was working in the US. But as we know, the American liberal arts system has quite a lot more flexibility and independence when it comes to course design and curriculum development. But there were lots of helpful resources from colleagues in the US on how they had implemented creative assessments in their teaching. And I think one of the first steps that we took when thinking about this approach was to really look at what other people were doing and look at examples in the US and the UK, kind of creative assessments or essays as they're often called. So in the UK HE context, of course, Lucy has created, uses a creative assignment in her Victorian Cities module, and Dr. Akhil Awan at Royal Holloway has written about his approach to the essay in his History of Terrorism module. And again, stressing how great it is that people are willing to share their resources via Twitter and blogs and institutional sites, that their reflections on their experiences have all been really helpful in thinking about how we actually do this. So sort of inspired by some of those approaches, but also being very aware that we were working within the confines of our own university curriculum approval process, which includes having to get modules approved about a year before you can actually deliver them. For our assessments, students were given a brief that asks them to focus on, firstly, on suitability. So does their research project use a format, a medium that suits its topic and approach? Secondly, meaning. Is the deeper historical meaning of their project clear? And finally, originality. So does this research add something new to the conversation? In other words, it's not just a kind of summary of material derived from other books or articles. And as part of our dedicated assessment workshop, these expectations are discussed in detail, including a discussion of how the brief and assessment criteria will be reflected in their written feedback. And this is how we present it to students. This is the feedback sheet, and we map the assessment brief onto the feedback sheets. We are really careful to stress that originality, which does intimidate a lot of students, is not about them revolutionizing the field, but about them telling us, you know, their conclusions from their reading of the primary evidence. And those conclusions might confirm, deny, highlight omissions, or kind of offer alternatives. We do have a very broad assessment criteria for the research project, which is based around those key themes of suitability, meaning, and originality, but a slightly more detailed criteria for the justification, where students are asked to identify, discuss, and engage with their primary evidence, show an awareness of the historical literature, as well as reference their work appropriately. And following that kind of process of submission and feedback, we also encourage our students to celebrate and share their work beyond us as the module team. So we have the UWE History Community blog, where lots of students are really pleased for us to share their work. Every year we have a transnational humanities celebration across our school, and you can see some images there from students presenting and sharing their work there. And in the final few minutes, we've also spoken to some of our former students who were really excited for us to just share some brief snapshots of their work with you today, because that's obviously the most exciting part of what we're doing.
So this is sort of, this slide pertains to one student's short story, Anna's short story, which really exemplifies the high quality of work students produce and the level of their engagement with their research projects. So the story explored marriage, reproduction, and the family in the early 20th century through extensive research into the Elizabeth Roberts Oral History Archive and Mary Stopes letters. As a joint honours student of English and history, Anna, as you can see from the sort of second paragraph on the side there, used her interdisciplinary skills to inform her narrative approach. Experiences encountered in the archive were woven skillfully throughout the story, and Anna demonstrated equal consideration and historiographical awareness in setting the story in Interwar Preston, the location of many of the Elizabeth Roberts interviews, and Manchester, where one of the earliest birth control clinics opened in 1926. I think one of the most powerful things, though, about Anna's work was the really candid way in which she drew out the resonances between historic and current insecurities about sex and attitudes to sex amongst young people. And I think we can both admit that we may have been moved to tears in the marking process in a good way. And you can all read Anna's story on the UWE History Community blog. It's linked on the slide there.
And then just briefly to talk about Lou's work. So she wanted to research experiences of wartime love, but with a particular focus on the relationships between African-American GIs and white British women, and something that she really wanted to communicate to a broader public audience through the means of an exhibition. So she looked at photograph collections and oral history accounts, but also drew on the work in another of her second year modules, which is an introduction to heritage, to explore how she might actually put together an exhibition using a combination of visual and auditory elements, and to really think quite carefully about how her exhibition might be experienced by visitors. So she used that research to build a diorama, which the images here do not adequately capture. It's amazing. And this was part of an exhibition plan as well, demonstrating where it would be situated within the exhibition space. So she aims to capture, as she writes in her justification, the ways that the arrival of African-American troops exacerbated the anxieties of sexuality and female autonomy, which were amplified in the war years. And you can see some of the key moments represented in the diorama, the kind of segregation in pubs and cinemas, and the kind of attempts of the military authorities to discourage socializing, as well as some of the consequences experienced by many of those women who became pregnant.
And very finally, this has got to be one of the most original responses we've had alongside Lou's diorama, was a sonnet exploring attitudes to prostitution in the campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts in the 1860s and 80s. It's based on extensive engagement with material produced by the campaign and the historiography. And the student Connor really wanted to highlight the challenge to patriarchal authority and sexuality made by Victorian feminists, but also the tensions within the repeal movement, particularly regarding the agency of working class women engaged in sex work. So Connor addressed contemporary criticisms of the male establishment, but also the perpetuation of women as victims, rather than as active agents engaged in reasoned economic activity. And importantly, how these issues continue to underpin debates concerning sex work today. What was perhaps most impressive about this piece of work was the choice of the sonnet form, because Connor explained how popular the Shakespearean sonnet was in the 19th century and how they tended to focus on topics of love, lust and infidelity, change and time. And he convincingly argued that this sort of theme of liberty and restriction in these sonnets really resonated with the issues of freedom of choice and regulation permeating discussions of Victorian prostitution and women's agency. We should move things along.
Yeah, so really just to conclude very briefly, what we've aimed to do in this module is to increase student investment in learning by making that space for creative engagement with history. We're encouraging students to engage more personally with the subject and hopefully developing key skills by fostering that kind of creativity and flexibility, and really exploring ways for students to communicate their research and understanding beyond essays and exams. We hope that our students are supported to become practicing historians, working closely with lots of different primary materials. And yeah, I think we've hopefully acculturated them into a research ethos, which leaves them better equipped for independent inquiry in their final year of study, as well as in their future careers. And so thank you very much for listening to us.
Yeah.
Get very excited about our module.
Yeah, I'm excited by that. I'm absolutely dazzled by the diorama. That's just absolutely floored me. I think it's incredible.
If we've got time later, Kath, we'll go and get it.
It isn't. We've got it in the other office. So we were thinking, can we try and show it? But we didn't want to. If we start tipping it up, we might dislodge things. Yeah. So
I was just thinking as you were showing those examples, you were talking about how students can be a bit overawed, a little bit, well, where do we start? And I think just actually showing examples from other types of courses, other types of university, you know, getting the sense that this is something that is normal now for people to be doing, that would be really helpful, because I think sometimes you find your own odd bits that you show people, but actually having some sort of creative history repository where, if with students sort of permission, we can show these examples, I think would be really helpful. I don't know what other people think about that. That might be a legacy, perhaps, Lucy, we can think about for these seminars.
And just to sort of say, when we approached the students about being able to share their work in this format, so many of them are quite excited about the fact that it's going on YouTube. They honestly, they were just so thrilled to kind of be asked, and to like that. So the idea that their work could be shown and to kind of inspire other students, I think would be certainly well received by the students, and I'm sure it would be really, really useful. I know we would find that really helpful.
We have got a couple of minutes for questions, so if anybody does have a question, please do raise your hand. Sam.
Thank you for a brilliant paper. Your module sounds amazing. Your students seem amazing. Well done to them. I wanted to ask a kind of boring question about the administrative side of it. So where you were saying, you know, you had a painting that was submitted, you've got this diorama. How do they physically submit, and how do you kind of get around the university regulations about deadlines and all of that stuff?
So we do have to have the online submission through Blackboard as the online learning environment that we use. So the justification is the easy part, that goes through as normal, and they submit that at the same time. And then with Lou's diorama, for example, she very carefully photographed it and had also done an exhibition plan to show where it sits within her planned exhibition. So she designed that on PowerPoint and could submit that through Blackboard. We've had songs, we've had video essays, we've had podcasts. So it's
one of those things that sort of the positive hangover of having to get to grips with so much more technology so quickly has meant that we have more resources, they have more resources, we can train them, or they have more experience, a bit like what you've been doing, Sam. So there are so many more options, but also when we're shaping the projects with them, we make sure that there is that opportunity for them to submit something digitally to meet the systems, you know, yes, something came through the portal criteria, but also to make sure that they're not limited by that as well. So when they come and say, can I make a physical piece of work? We're like, yes, because actually, you know, we've had students who've kind of toyed with the idea of doing, you know, cross stitch and things like that. And I mean, the process of that, making and thinking about the traditions there, but the messages that they can communicate, that one actually got pulled just on the basis that it was taking them so long. But, you know, we don't want to stifle the creativity, but we will help work around them to make sure that the systems don't let them down as well. So.
Thank you.
Can I just ask very quickly, you said that you've now got this what did you call her, creative assessment technician or something, so how have you managed to get that? is one question. And I suppose my other question is, you know, we were talking about the sort of workload aspects of that, and the fact that you've got so many different kinds of assessment that people are doing, even with a justification. How have you found that in terms of stretching your own skills in advising them?
Yeah, I mean, we'll take the second part first. We were talking about this earlier because we were sort of saying, you know, we do genuinely co-teach this module, but you know, the university workload modelling system doesn't really encourage that. We do it because we actively kind of get more out of teaching it together, but we don't get double the allocation of time for the module. So that is something that is not possible all the time and for everybody, but at the same time, when it comes to the marking, it helps that there's two of us. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts there, and because there are two of us, that's sort of the first and second marking taken care of.
I think there's a lot more moderation on this module actually, because of being really careful about making sure that we're using the flexibility of the assessment criteria, but also really sticking to it as well, so to make sure there's parity. And our external examiner's given us loads of really kind of useful feedback on it as well, which has been great, and positive feedback too, which obviously everybody likes, but it's good to hear as well. In terms of the creative project technician, so Miranda's sort of been working across the school and she wanted to do more of this stuff, so we went, right, would you be up for being a creative project technician? And she's like, that would be great, you know, because then she can use all the skills she has, and they're fascinating to kind of really support our students. And we're really excited to see, I mean, it's starting this year, so, you know, it's just launching. I'm hoping that it will be really good for students who have got a brilliant idea straight away to kind of keep that, you know, refined, focused, you know, to help them realize it. But also for those students, because we don't give them any options, it can't be an essay. For those students who are just going, I don't know what to do, they can go and have a conversation with Miranda, which might again take away any apprehension about I'm talking to the markers. So yeah.
That's good. Justin, is it a quick question?
It's a quick question. I suppose it depends on how quick the answer is. I can hold it till later because it might be more appropriate maybe for everyone's project. So I'm happy to wait until final discussion. That'd
be great. I think just so that I think all of the talks are really sort of dovetailing with each other. So hopefully it will all come together really nicely. So I'll pass you on to Lucy then, who is going to introduce our next speaker.
So I'm really excited to be inviting Billie Gina to present on her topic. And I don't know if you want to start putting your slides up, Billie. Billie was my I don't know. Are you there, Billie? Hi, Billie.
Yes, I am here. Sorry.
Oh, brilliant.
A bit of a flap over the other side of the room.
It's really funny because actually Billie and I are sharing an office, and she's moved into a classroom opposite to present. But Billie was my PhD student, and I know so much about her work. But this is one aspect that I perhaps don't get to see a lot of as her former PhD supervisor. So I'm really excited to hear about her experiences working with the Brilliant Club, but also bringing more kinds of diversity into our teaching as well. Thank you.
So can everyone see the slides?
Yeah.
Perfect. I can't see myself. It's a little bit strange, or anybody else. So do give me a shout if anything untoward does happen. So yeah, thank you ever so much for inviting, for putting on this fantastic event. Obviously inviting me and the rest of the presenters as well. I think this kind of event is we've all been kind of crying out for it as we come through the pandemic. It's a really an opportunity to celebrate teaching triumphs and learning new ways of that we can use going forward as well. So this paper is called Queer in the Classroom and the Vic Transients, and I will be using my own research on 19th century gender nonconformity and trans history in Victorian Britain to demonstrate how I've actually brought this idea of an area of research into teaching in both a secondary school platform with the Brilliant Club and within my own institution when teaching undergraduates as well. So I completed my PhD in 2020, which is called Not Every Man Was Male, Gender Passing in 19th Century Britain. And a shameless plug, but if anybody would like to download a copy of my thesis, they can scan the very snazzy QR code on there. But in my research, I located 25 different cases of gender nonconformity in 19th century Britain. And I looked specifically at those who were assigned female at birth and lived and presented as men throughout their lives. This included sort of their physical appearance, their own sort of sense of identity, the relationships they had with women, and the jobs they undertook as well. And essentially, these individuals lived a heterocentric lifestyle and completely sort of slotted into this heterosexual and cisgendered life. Due to unforeseen circumstances, however, such as death, self-exposure, or non-related criminal convictions, these individuals were ultimately revealed as being assigned female at birth. And I predominantly used newspapers as the basis of the primary material and then pieced them together to create an understanding of these individuals. Mostly people were labelled as female husbands, which you might be familiar with the term, or concealment of sex cases in the 19th century. But due to the kind of biological assumptions associated with both female husband and concealment of sex, it became sort of problems in that sense. There was not really enough consideration given to gender presentation going forwards. And ultimately, it can really be difficult to access complete histories of gender non-conforming people, especially with a lack of individual testimony. As a result, using anything and everything available from census records, trade directories, marriage and death certificates, pamphlets, street ballads, which I'll refer to in a little bit, have all been sort of gathered by me to really create these microbiographies about individual existence. Now, I think we've seen trans and gender non-conforming history really gaining momentum in recent years, with scholarship engaging more and more with non-heterocentric people. And this has come with the publication of sort of specific trans-focused books like Jem Mannion's Female Husbands in 2020, Sean Fay's The Transgender Issue in 21, and more recently Kit Hayham's book, Before We Were Trans, just this year. And with these books becoming more accessible and readily available, it sort of enables a familiarity within gender nonconformity, and people begin to sort of realise this importance with moving beyond the heteronormative focus. It's essential to sort of peek behind this heterosexual veil that seemingly covers kind of every ounce of the past and start to really queer the archive. And as historians, we're frequently encouraged to do this. It must be said that there is a level of increased understanding around gender nonconformity, particularly, I think, amongst younger generations. Young people are more aware of how important it is to be their authentic selves, whatever that may be, and they're more familiar with LGBT+ people being represented perhaps on screen and television, as well as within their own classrooms and their own environments and lives as well. And obviously, as we heard in the previous paper, you know, thinking about potentially sort of people who are queer moving into these sort of queer modules and opportunities as well within our teaching. Again, as you kind of move to the sort of university angle, students are a lot more free to explore really and engage with what they want to. And the history undergraduate is sort of away perhaps from this school-based teaching of world wars, Tudors, revolutions, and into something different, sort of pushing themselves, thinking about gender identity historically, LGBT specific lives, and in my case as well, sort of gender nonconformity. Now, just before my final year of my PhD, I became a tutor for the Brilliant Club. Now, for anyone who's not familiar, the Brilliant Club is a charity, and their mission is to mobilise the PhD community to support students who are less advantaged to access the most competitive universities and succeed when they get there. Now, as part of the programme, tutors are asked to create a 6-week course based around an aspect of their research, and then ultimately go into the classroom and deliver it to 12 students who have been selected by their own teachers to participate. This is really sort of a privileged opportunity that brings together students who are perhaps not fully reaching their potential with those who are kind of exceeding their potential, to sort of maintain this high level of engagement and build a sort of community within those sort of seminar sessions. Now, tutors create a module handbook, and I'm really annoyed that I've not brought mine along to show you. But we also set regular sort of homework, mark it accordingly, offering feedback to students weekly, create obviously sort of stimulating and engaging seminars with academic readings and tasks for students to complete as well. Tutors are also available on a virtual learning environment for the duration of the course, which is monitored accordingly as well. And the accumulation of the course is the students are asked to complete 2,000-word essay, allowing them to bring together what they've actually learned throughout the course, as well as challenge them really to go away and complete their own research as well. Now, during my time with the Brilliant Club, I completed 4 placements in the Merseyside area, including the Sutton Academy, St Julie's Catholic High School, Chilwell Sports and Science Academy, and Cardinal Catholic High School as well. Now, my course was called Gender Passing and the Body in 19th Century Britain, and in it we sort of used 2 case studies throughout the course to sort of draw attention to the sort of themes of each week, which was James Allen and Harry Stokes. Now, James Allen was a shipyard worker and appeared in the press as being labelled as a female husband after his death in January 1829. And it was at this time he was also revealed as being a assigned female at birth, much to the shock of his then wife, Abigail Allen, who positively denied that she had any denied all knowledge of her husband's being assigned female at birth. James was a solid provider for his wife, however, for over 20 years, and a pamphlet was produced after his death with several different street ballads that retold his story. James' case was also referred to in other gender non-conforming cases throughout the 19th century. Harry Stokes, on the other hand, was labelled as the female husband of Manchester in 1838 when he first appeared in the press after his wife of nearly 20 years exposed him as being assigned female at birth due to him withholding the weekly house from her. Now, Harry was known as being a sort of quote-unquote master bricklayer, and he was really sort of well-liked and celebrated within the community. People were familiar with his work, newspapers commented. Despite his identity being publicly exposed, Harry remained living in the Manchester area throughout his lifetime and also continued to live and present as a man. Harry had long-term committed relationships with other women and was a public house landlord as well as a special constable. In 1859, however, his body was found in the sluice of the River Irwell, and newspapers concluded that he'd taken his own life due to drowning. Now, in the course, I look at different aspects of Harry and James's life and provided students with a primary source pack complete with newspaper articles, medical and police documents, census material, and street ballads for them to create their own sort of biography or microbiography about these individuals. Now, one of my favourite homework tasks that I would set is writing a street ballad based on gender nonconformity. Now, as you can imagine, this is usually met with moans and groans of people actually having to sort of think of the particulars of, you know, a poem. Most obviously, does it have to rhyme and things of that nature. But this task comes after sort of we read a street ballad about James Allen called The Female Husband, and it's one of the sort of well-received homeworks that I ended up receiving everybody's sort of piece, even though there's always complaints at the beginning. Now, street ballads obviously were important in the 19th century because they allowed those stories to really sort of travel and gossip, and we unpack that within our discussion as well. In terms of the sort of ballads themselves, they're kind of pasted on walls, performed on street corners, and although it didn't have anybody performing their street ballads in the classroom, we did talk about the importance of that during particularly sort of 19th century working class lives, etc. Now, after James's death, he was hit on the head by a piece of fallen timber in the dockyards where he worked, and as a result, this kind of sort of sparked these two street ballads. The first is called The Female Husband and can be found in Alison Oram and Anne-Marie Turnbull's book, The Lesbian History Source Book, and one with the not so very catchy title, The Female Husband Who's Been Married to Another Female for 21 Years, and that can be found in Charles Hindley's book, Curiosities of Street Literature. Now, the first ballad we look at in class was written about James Allen, referencing his sort of different jobs, including as a groom. And in the session, we really think about how the opening stanza seems to mock James and really question the possibility of he and his wife Abigail even marrying. And the opening stanza reads, "If you want to hear a bit of fun, listen unto me about a female husband, the like you never see. Such a singular thing you never know, no not in all your life, as two females to be wed and live as man and wife." Evidently, there's this attention to sort of the binary roles and codes of gender of the time, with a biological focus on James being assigned female at birth. And the ballad goes on further to sort of comment in the chorus. "So young women all a warning take, and mark what I do say. Before you wed, your husbands try, or else you'll rue the day." And it's interesting that the author of this ballad, who ultimately remains anonymous, really encourages this sort of promiscuity amongst women and tells them to sort of try their husbands out first to confirm their identity before they marry them. The sort of halfway through the ballad, then there is a sort of different focus and a change in pace, perhaps, and it discusses the couple's inability to produce children, noting, "Now for 20 years they lived as man and wife, so clever, both eat and drank and slept, and just these things together. If women all could do the same and keep their virgin knot, why the king and all his subjects would quickly go to pot." And here there's sort of this lack of reproduction becomes a worry, and again sort of teasing out those historic conversations, sort of gendered focus, and of course sort of familial focus, heterosexual angle is also sort of pulled out within our discussions as well. Now, in the second ballad, you consider there's a conversation happening between Mother Chatter and Mother Sprightly, and a narrator who seems to sort of be a wife of a gender non-conforming person. And the opening line, the opening stanza on screen here. "What wonder now I have to pense, women turning into mense, For 21 long years or more, sir, she wore the breeches, we are told, sir. A smart and active, handsome groomsman, sir. She then got married very soon, sir. And again, like the previous ballad, there is this reference to the sort of wives being potentially tricked and marrying their female husband, to quote the title of the ballad. And again, conversations develop with that. And ultimately, the task is to go away using these as a sort of example and then create your own. Now, I've received nearly 40 different street ballads interpretations from students who have completed, but this was the first one I ever received, and it always really stands out from a 14-year-old student at the time who was at the Sutton Academy in St Helens. And I'll just sort of read it to you in full, because it is really quite, I think, poignant. Does your husband have a beard upon his pretty face? If the answer is no, another should take his place. Your husband may be well known and liked by all around, but if he is a female, his secret will be found. Your husband may be a bricklayer or work in any weather, but please just keep in mind what may be under his clothes of leather. If you are hearing this and feeling distressed, please keep in mind that gender cannot be suppressed. And here I think you can really see how the student has brought in obviously elements from the original street ballad, with the worry about men, the question of men being really men being brought into the conversation, and then bringing the sort of argument up to present day, really commenting on how gender cannot nor should it be suppressed. And this was something that we teased out in seminars as well, thinking about how we can sort of, if we could go back and talk to these people, you know, what would you tell them? What would life be like? Now, the setup of the Brilliant Club is very much focused on a university-style experience of teaching and ultimately moving away from the static nature of the classroom. And each year, the Brilliant Club puts together a national magazine and it publishes the best pieces of work from graduating students. Now, the magazine is called The Scholar, and it's sent to all schools, to all participants in school. And its aim is for students to get their work published, and arguably what we as academics want for ourselves. Now, only a handful of essays are actually published from each region, and I was lucky enough to have one of my students get their work published in the magazine in 2020. And what was actually really brilliant to see was that as tutors, we offer peer review, and there are certain criteria for how essays are marked. So it is a rigorous process. And the student from my group came with such high acclaim, and I'd argue it even rivaled some of my undergraduate level 4 students' work as well from this 14-year-old. What was brilliant to see was that the student was really sort of goal motivated, and that he really wanted to get this piece of work published in this magazine. Granted, when we first had the session, there was this level of skepticism about him and, you know, confusion around what historic gender nonconformity was, how you can kind of move away from this binary existence. But definitely the person changed their sort of style throughout, and they wrote so eloquently and sort of researched more about individual cases for the final output, even looking at my other supervisor, Dr. Emma Vickers' work, and sort of seeing the expanse of the angle and the research scope as well, which was brilliant to see. So then moving out of the secondary school classroom and thinking more about exploring historic gender nonconformity within undergraduate, I'm going to spend like a little time reflecting on a module that I was a part of just last academic year. It was called Exploring History, and students picked a strand with that staff members were leading. My strand was Trans Through Time, and each session was dedicated to a different theme. For instance, one we look at secondary material to sort of support around knowledge. Another week we create primary material, and I'd show them how to sort of search British Library newspapers or the Digital Transgender Archive website, for example, to locate some material, with the ultimate assessment being to produce a museum-like exhibition for their peers and staff as well. My group went away and worked collectively and collaboratively to produce posters and general displays that examined and followed the following themes. There was 19th century trans lives through sailors and soldiers, 19th century trans lives female husbands, the road from impersonation to drag, and representation of trans people. And I also took the students to Liverpool Central library to access April Ashley's personal archive. And for most students, this was their first experience in an archive, or even sort of accessing a public library without restriction. As this was very much a student-led project, it was my first time being the module leader in this sense, or the strand leader. I actually didn't know what to expect. Ultimately, however, the students produced a really high quality and a high level of work in the exhibition that you can see on screen here. The feedback I always receive is that most people are not aware of trans or gender nonconformity historically, and the students themselves did not realise that there was kind of like this longevity to gender nonconformity. Although we look specifically at the 19th century, you know, that not gender nonconformity goes back much further, Roman times, for instance, as well as having a global span, thinking about sort of two-spirit people from Indigenous America or the Hijra in India, for instance. So students sort of opted to choose this strand as an opportunity for these interesting conversations to really develop as well. One student actually created an original piece of artwork for their poster, where they took on the iconic image of April Ashley that you can see on screen there, sort of overlaid it with the colours of the trans flag to sort of create this new image. And this was placed centrally with the exhibition sort of being built around it. Now, this level of creativity was from a student themselves who felt that they wanted to sort of commemorate their experience of engaging with April Ashley's archive and celebrate her life in a positive way. And so much so, the Central Library Archivist has asked for these posters to be given to or donated to the library, and they will be also archived with April Ashley material as well. Now, one of the main challenges I faced was largely to do with myself, particularly when thinking about the Brilliant Club. Just due to the nature of my research being about trans history, I personally didn't think schools would be interested or indeed welcoming to this area of history, particularly religious schools. This meant I kind of waited for a couple of years before doing the Brilliant Club and actually make this leap. And I was really wrong to have waited, to be honest, because the schools and students that I worked with were fantastic. Most of the students would really stay for the duration of the seminars and get involved with the work that the students were doing, because they were also interested in it. When making this leap from school teaching, where I was providing the students with every primary and secondary source, to an undergraduate level, where I wanted students to go away and find their materials, was a challenge. And I made some assumptions wrongly about how students understand trans history, and quickly realised that I needed to spend more time explaining and showing them where to access appropriate material as well. Of course, online teaching was also a challenge at times, as everyone knows, and I completed one placement for the Brilliant Club remotely, but this was particularly difficult because most schools didn't have any technology to allow students to speak to me and participate sort of fully in Zoom calls, as well as sort of internet not being available and sort of logistical things like that. But the students were resilient and continued to work through the seminars and produce excellent work, and the VLA in that sense was sort of really utilised in more instances. For my undergraduates, getting them to sort of into the archive physically was a challenge due to sort of restrictions in our local library up until I think it was March this year. Once they had this opportunity to visit there, it was great to see them really flourish and engage with this original material, which for most of them coming out, which was the first, as I mentioned before, for most of them coming out of lockdowns and restrictions and things. Now, the sort of aim for this paper was really to highlight some of the ways that I've brought my expertise into teaching in both school and higher education setting. But as I now sit here, I'm thinking sort of ahead and trying to think about how I can potentially incorporate some of Sam's and Rose, and I'm so sorry, I've forgotten Laura's name there for a moment, but really think about how I can incorporate them as we sort of head into semester 2 as well. And appreciate this is just a sort of small snippet and participating in these things, but it's an opportunity for us to get together and sort of celebrate, as I say, what we do, and sort of continue pushing on, because it's these sessions, these creative elements that really sit with students and stay with them for a long time. And as both Laura and Rose said, you know, bringing in those conversations and bringing the skill base as they go forward as well. So thank you ever so much for your time. I think I've probably run over and I apologise, but if there are any questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thanks, Billy. That was really fascinating. I loved hearing about how creative actually, like younger students, young people, I should say, actually, probably. So can I open the floor out for questions at all? Yes, Sam.
Hi, Billie Gina. Thank you for a really great paper. It's wonderful to hear about all the work you're doing. I was wondering whether, like me, you'd found that being creative with the students, encouraging them to engage with the past through creative expression might be particularly useful for queer histories and trans histories, because the nature of those histories is kind of quite fluid, and it's not about trying to go back and say this person was definitely trans and let's stick a label on this person. So I was wondering how you'd found the fluidity of the creative side of assessments mapped onto the fluidity of that history.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think, as you say, I mean, essays are so restrictive. You've got those parameters of just filling in this document, and actually allowing that fluidity and expression to sort of come through. And yeah, it happens within the sort of classroom setting, but people don't necessarily get to, colleagues and things aren't in that classroom and privy to those fantastic conversations that we have with students. So allowing that to sort of expression to come through within their own outputs and sort of taking control really of that is really, really exciting. And it's really important to think as well for them. I mean, I've created for this semester, I've created a debate strand, which is called, pardon the pun, querying the debate. And at the end of the session, at the end of the term, sorry, I want to get them to all do a page out for a zine within the seminar, so we can actually sort of reflect on everything that we've done, but just get a bit messy, a bit sort of primitive in our glues and sticks, and just let everybody just have a relax around the table and just get things in a different sort of creative way, and those conversations can come out within that sort of output that you make as well with them. So yeah, there's a great opportunity for that fluidity throughout, for sure.
Oh, thank you. I just think that point that you made there about kind of getting a bit messy with it is a really good one, because I've just found that with essays, a lot of students still have that thing in mind of like, I'm going to set it out with, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, and then I'm going to come to a conclusion. And so much of this history is about sitting with the subjectivities and the messiness of it, and allowing students the space to think that's okay. Like, you can say it's complicated, and that sometimes is the only answer we can give, and we can explore the complications. Yeah, it sounds like that's really coming through in what you've been doing with high school students as well, which is just amazing that you've managed to get that kind of reaction from them. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Conscious of time, so we should probably move on to our final paper with Justin and Molly. If you want to set up your slides, and I'll move you over to Kath.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Billie Gina. And also what you were saying about messiness, I think is really interesting. Basically, what you were explaining with the zine workshop there is what Lucy and I have we're in the middle of planning that for our last session of Creative Histories. We're going to do a zine workshop together. So that's a good advert for getting messy. Okay, so our last speakers today, I'm very pleased to say, are Molly Merriman, who is, let me just get this right, I'm getting it right, Kent State University. Hope I've got that one right. And Justin Bengry, who is at Goldsmiths University. And I think I'm right in saying that even though you're at Goldsmiths, you're both joining us from the United States today. So I'll hand over to you. Be really interesting to see your different perspectives on this and how you've sort of had a conversation together about how to look at creative approaches to LGBT plus. Sorry, I'm not able to speak today. How you can actually sort of creatively engage with that in the classroom. I'll pass over to you.
Thanks so much, Kath. And actually, that's a really great way of introducing the project, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how Molly and I have negotiated how to engage with these issues as students and incorporate them and include them in the production of research and knowledge. So some of this overlaps directly with credit-bearing teaching, and some of it doesn't. So it's well, I guess, to build from the last paper, it's a bit messy. And I just want to say too, what an incredible honor it is to follow at the conclusion of hearing about such incredible projects. It wasn't clear to me until very recently that I'd be able to participate today, so I'm so very glad that I could join you today. It's just been incredible. So what I'm going to be doing, Molly and I have split up our 20 minutes. I'm going to be giving some background into the project and setting it up before Molly comes in with slides and discussing some of the more explicitly pedagogical. But I wanted to give you some background on the Queer Pandemic Project to kind of set up what we're doing and how teaching and learning was integrated into the project from the beginning, because we imagined, well, at the start of the pandemic, Molly and we immediately recognized there's something going on here that we need to record. There's something going on that needs to be preserved. And we're very privileged to be at a moment where we can do that while it's happening. And we both recognize that LGBTQ plus people's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic is unique for a variety of reasons, because of the threat to community, families of choice, the necessity of many queer people to build community in alternative spaces. All of that, of course, is jeopardized when just the very act of coming together in proximity could be dangerous and very often life-threatening. In other cases, there's issues of healthcare provision for LGBTQ plus people that's very different. And in a global pandemic, those issues of access to appropriate healthcare become heightened. Those are just two. Many others came up in the course of our interviews, but we recognized immediately that this is something that needed to be done right away. And we also wanted to think about how students could be involved from the very beginning. We wanted to integrate this into our teaching. Both of us are very committed teachers. We work a lot with LGBTQ plus students and come from those communities ourselves. And this was going to be integral to the project. So I've tried to come up with that. I was thinking about the wording of this. It's not that our pedagogical concerns and teaching came out of the project, but actually the project and teaching really have been mutually constitutive from its foundations. So that said, Queer Pandemic is a international collaboration. It's a three-part collaboration between Kent State University, where Molly is, Goldsmiths, University of London, where I am, and Queer Britain, the recently launched British LGBTQ plus museum. Molly wears two hats, being both an associate professor at Kent and also a research director of Queer Britain. But this kind of collaboration just seemed obvious to us from the beginning, that we could be part of creating the core collections that constitute the Queer Britain Museum, while also undertaking a really robust research project. And this involvement of students, like I said, has been integral to the project since the very beginning. They would be involved in actually creating museum collections, and they have been involved on both sides of the Atlantic. Students, primarily undergraduate students in Ohio, have worked alongside and with my postgraduate students on the MA Queer History. This started out with pilots of the project, in which students were interviewed as interviewees and interviewers on the project, and has continued as students remained interviewers on the Oral History Project. So Queer Pandemic is a video-based oral history project to record the unique experiences of LGBTQ plus people of the pandemic. Our goal, which we're moving pretty swiftly toward, we had a meeting yesterday, and we kind of surprised ourselves how far along it's gotten. Our goal was to have at least 100 interviews, which would make it certainly one of the most significant LGBTQ plus oral history collections in the UK, and certainly the largest queer oral history collection related to the pandemic in the world. It is as broad as possible in scope and inclusivity, and we include all 4 constitutive nations of the UK. We have actually achieved pretty good distribution across identity categories related to gender, sexuality, race and ethnicity. We're working on ability, but even that is represented. It's actually been quite surprising to me how readily a range of people have participated in the project, when of course that is one of the challenges of many oral history projects, is that wider diversity and inclusivity, however great the intentions are of the organizers of the project. So it's ongoing in that way. We've got I think we've got 40 plus interviews already undertaken, and we've got 30 or 40 people in waiting to be interviewed to share their story. So in terms of some of the issues around creativity that this involves, Molly and I both believe really strongly that oral history is a creative endeavor itself. And I think this comes through to the students in particular who undertake multiple interviews with different people, because of course that first experience of doing an interview is very intimidating. You're focused on your questions, you want to get it right. But as they build up more comfort and more confidence in being interviewers, they start to realize, of course, that it is a conversation, particularly since almost all of the students identify as LGBTQ+ themselves. So it does become, in some cases, a bit more of a conversation, and they realize actually the impact that they're having on this co-production of testimony about the pandemic. It becomes part of them creating this story in collaboration with the narrator. It becomes in part their own telling of a narrative, even though they are the less dominant vocalizer in the relationship. They nonetheless begin to realize the creative input they can have by following up on questions, by asking for things further, by pressing on some issues, by letting go of others. That it really is a narrative, that is a creative production that is being produced between both of them. We also include the students in reevaluating the question guide that we've created. So it is quite an extensive question guide of 50-odd questions. But of course, the pandemic has evolved over the last few years, and so too must the questions. And students become involved then in giving us feedback on those questions, which ones work, which ones don't, what needs to be reevaluated, suggesting new ones, things that they might see gaps that we haven't considered in the research project. All of these we propose to them are also creative interventions into the project that could have a whole variety of outcomes. So all of these issues, I reiterate to students how creative the act of oral history is, while also creating a real skill that they need as part of their studies. At Goldsmiths, it's non-credit bearing. I haven't been able to integrate it into existing modules, so it stands as a kind of voluntary mini module that we offer sometimes, which does give me a lot of flexibility, because at least for those who participate, I don't have to worry about approvals for assessments and grades and everything else. I can just do what I want. But of course, then it means that it is pretty much all voluntary labor or comes out of my scant research time. So there is payoffs to doing it kind of off the clock, as it were, but also incredible challenges. I mean, this is something that's come up several times, of course, issues around workload. In terms of the creativity too, and the way that we have integrated this collaboration into our own programs. And I think this is really unusual and has been incredibly fruitful for both the students and also for Molly's and my working relationship. This is a blend of our two programs, and there is a difference between it being queer history on one side of the pond and LGBT studies in the American Academy on the other. So it brings together students from history and outside of history in combination and in collaboration. So a combination of disciplines, a combination of our two programs, and international collaboration. Also, this combination of undergrad and postgrad students working together, which I think is quite unusual itself as well, and really offers all kinds of opportunities to, well, think differently about education, think differently about how projects can be undertaken, and I think also demystifies the process as well. It's not just one or two students working with the professor who is the expert on high that tells them how the project will run, but in fact they become participants in the evolution of the project. And even if they're postgrad students, they see the value of the undergrad students' involvement as well and their participation as well, and imagine themselves at that stage in their education participated in a project like this, or for others that are outside of queer history, at Goldsmiths, outside of the queer history MA, or outside of the history department. I've sometimes had some involved as well. And I've really appreciated this opportunity to work with Molly on this project that is more unusual and creative in terms of how we integrate research and teaching into our practice. And it sits alongside, this is why I've been so very interested in everyone else's projects, of course. It sits alongside other creative projects that I have in modules on public history, really in line with some of what we've been hearing today. Also creative placements with projects around London. I was delighted to see Sean Cannon in the audience earlier. I don't know if you're still here, but I've had several students over the years placed with Sean. And integrating creative opportunities with outside partners, I think, is also a really exciting way of doing that, where, again, it gets around some of those issues around assessment, if that's happening outside the university and it's only the reflection that they're undertaking. But that would be an entirely other conversation and presentation. But let me just finish there, given my 10 minutes are up, and pass it over to Molly to get into some of the more explicit pedagogical directions of the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for providing the background context of this. And I am now again trying to find my, there it is, my presentation. Apologies for that. Is everybody seeing it okay? Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. So as Justin mentioned, one of our collaborators with this is the Queer Britain Museum, and it currently has a space in Granary Square, King's Cross, London. And in particular for students from Kent State University, Kent State is primarily a first generation, largely working class and marginalized students as undergraduate institution. And so to be able to connect with the museum, particularly as the students who themselves identify as LGBTQ, has been incredibly powerful and important to them. I wanted to provide this slide that you might want to go back to, and you could see some of the previous videos we've done with Virtually Queer. But Virtually Queer is largely intended to be a large video-based oral history collection that now does include the Queer Pandemic projects. And from the establishment of Virtually Queer, pedagogical approaches have been very important, as well as the research approaches. And so it was, the relationship was formed with great consideration involving LGBTQ studies from Kent State into this. So back in 2018, we did a project that connected with the Salisbury Arts Center. This is before the museum had physical space. And we had a project called Our Naked Skin that looked at cis and trans women and their experiences with activism. From there, we started to expand the academic connections, and as Justin noted, it is this synergy between Kent State and Goldsmiths. And we've been involving at Kent State students and courses that are at the graduate level and the undergraduate level, and have crossed fields, including sociology, political science, LGBTQ studies, history, peace and conflict studies, the Honors College, and now design innovation. We also are in a final bit of the project that I'll be talking about, now connecting with Schools Out and the National LGBTQ History Month. So I'll skip over this. This is what Justin was telling you about. And again, if you return to this slide, you can see links to this current project. But at the museum, we were, confronted with how does one turn research into a museum? And so on the left, you see a fabulous drawing that I made that somehow the designers for Queer Britain were able to turn into what you see on the right, which is a much more beautiful rendering of the Queer Pandemic exhibit. This is part of a larger exhibition called We Are Queer Britain. And I want to draw your attention to the photographs that are on the wall. And what these are is a project called Isolated Lens that involved one of my students who is a peace and conflict studies student, but also is a creative writing and photography major. And one of the challenges we faced with an exhibition was the interviews were conducted on Zoom, which doesn't translate well into still imagery. So we needed some still images for this and future exhibitions. So I worked with my undergraduate student, and we came up with a guided selfie project, which is called Isolated Lens. And here are some close-ups of the images that you see on the wall. And so what we did was we stepped back into subjects that we interviewed and asked them to express themselves in photographic form and submit selfies that Jeremy guided them with creating. So, talking to them about lighting, helping them with the composition and the editing of their photographs, and making decisions about how to best represent themselves in an exhibition. And so we see some people, like on the left with the cat, who chose to represent themselves as they were in front of Zoom in their offices. And then, we have two other images that are expressing the freedoms that people missed when they were part of this. And Jeremy has taken this project now and has turned it into a senior's thesis that he's working on for the remainder of the year. And so we'll be continuing to do these interviews and gather these photographs. Another creative outcome of the project is viral verses. And we have a third faculty member named Lauren Vachon, who is the coordinator of LGBTQ studies here at Kent State University. And she also is a poet and involved with our English department. So when we were invited to launch with the museum, I had reached out to the U.S. Embassy and applied for a grant so that I could, if successful, and I was, travel to some of the cities where we collected interviews. And prior to the museum's exhibition opening up, and during Pride Month, travel through the UK and have a touring exhibition. And we wanted to add something to that. And Lauren and then one of her students, who is an LGBTQ studies minor, came up with viral verses. And so the student was involved in selecting transcript sections. We wanted to make sure to have appropriate content. And by that, what I mean is with a project around COVID, we have some very difficult stories. We have people who lost family members and friends. We have people who were sick. We didn't want to use those parts of transcripts for someone to turn into poetry, because erasure poetry can be silly, it can be fun. And so Lauren and her student spent time really finding aspects that would lend themselves towards creating good poetry and also be appropriate in terms of not offending an interview subject if their testimony was turned into a silly poem. We also made sure to represent a diversity of subjects, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, and also geographic regions. As it stands in the museum, and this is in the, this actually is in Queer Britain, this photograph here, what we did was use paper, and we've provided colored pencils, and people have, in the museum and also at events we've had, really involve themselves in the poetry. And the way we set up the paper format itself is that people can participate, have fun with it, take it home, stick it on their fridge. And if they want, take a photo and share with the museum. They can leave it behind if they would like. And if they leave it behind, it can either be anonymous or they can sign it. This is one example of a poem that came from an event that we did in Belfast. And as you can see here, it is, you know, quite simple and quite profound. And so, you know, what they have said here is, my family don't know I'm LGBTQ. And so this is one way that that viral verses can be done. But as I mentioned, we also make sure they have colored pencils. And so you can also end up with, you know, real creative works of art that people leave behind. This was an example from Cardiff, Wales, and the circled words are, I made money from a feet party. And so, you know, we do have really good representations of fun art as well. At this point, we have around 35 submissions to Viral Verses. And next up for us is that we are going to be going virtual. And we received some internal money from Kent State University, and we're partnering with our Wick Poetry Center, who have a proprietary and very creative web engine that they've used. And I provide a link here that you can go back to that demonstrates what it's capable of. But this will incorporate video, imagery, and allow people online to be creating poetry in the same way that they've done with paper. And so we're going to launch this in February for LGBTQ History Month. And we're collaborating with Schools Out so that we can make this part of their national LGBTQ History Month activities. And as well, Lauren and myself are involving graduate and undergraduate students in curating what goes onto this website, deciding, you know, which poems and which videos ought to be included. And also, we're going to be using this in creative writing classes at Kent State University, and students will be participating in creating poetry. We also are currently exploring the publication of a poetry chapbook of viral verses. And so, you know, those are some of the outputs, and each step of the way, we're really, as Justin mentioned, involving students in project design and involving them in creative ways, and also, I think, quite importantly, in decision making. And I know, you know, Justin will agree with me that we have been very pleased to have our students improve our work in very meaningful and significant ways. So thank you.
Thank you so much. To me, listening to that at the moment, I'm trying to put together a project with colleagues in design, and I just got so much inspiration from you, in the sense of you're not thinking of research, teaching, and public engagement as separate elements of that. You're seeing it as all together and reinforcing each other, and the students as really part of that. So that was really great for me to see. I might steal a couple of your ideas, but I'll definitely give you credit for it. We have a couple of minutes left for questions. I don't know if Lucy, I can't see you on the camera. I've just realised that both Lucy and me have an interesting relationship to time. We're both dyspraxic, so we might have timed it a little bit. But if anybody's got any questions, please put your hand up, and we can hopefully round this off with a really good discussion.
I don't know, Josh, if you're if you're kind of like still in the midst of like putting things together, but maybe whilst people are thinking of questions, you could show some of the creative things that's been going on in the background. Josh has been drawing our papers for us and like illustrating them. So it might be fun to kind of see them as we perhaps wrap up. But of course, please do ask any questions. Just put your hands up. And we started a bit late, so I'm sure our speakers don't mind hanging around a bit longer if they're around for any questions.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Josh. I'm doing the illustrations here in the background, scribbling away. I've had a bit of a problem. My software has been updated, and it means that it's not sharing properly in my screen. So there's just a small aspect there of my drawing, but I've just tried to get a bit of everything in there. You will see the organ grinder as drag artiste. I think that's showing up on your screen. That was very interesting. The female husband and the idea of street ballads as a kind of a legitimate kind of research that really appealed to me. Let me see if I can go back and you can see some of the other drawing. I don't know how much you can see there. I will share these properly online and through email after the event. But here we've got, I don't know how much you can see there. They were talking about the active participation and gender and sexuality in modern Britain. And these, you can see there's somebody having a conversation, a student conversing with someone an older person about their experience, and behind them is the WW2 diorama and the letters, and Beyond the Lomax musicals poster and Jack the Ripper Museum. So I've just tried to grab a bunch of references that I've heard over the course of the session and get those on the page. So I shall share those with you after the event.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions for Molly and Justin? I must admit, one of the things I was thinking when I was listening to your paper was how working with external partners have really enhanced your kind of freedom and maybe the creative ways of doing history. I just wondered if you've got any kind of practical advice for how to navigate those types of relationships, and how to kind of sell teaching as a part of that relationship and not just research impact and agendas.
Yeah, I guess I could go first, and then Justin, if you want to add into that. Yeah, you know, I have done other projects, particularly film projects where I've involved external partners, and I think that what is important in the beginning is to really establish rules and boundaries and expectations, and you know, with Queer Britain, we created a memorandum of understanding that you know, really ensured that we would as researchers and teachers be in control. You know, we didn't want any fundraising agendas or you know, any agendas related to the museum to connect with that. And as well, I think we had to explain to the museum that that you know, often academic research might reveal things and present things in a way that a public forward institution might be a little bit more uncomfortable about. Again, you know, them not having that control. And so I do think that really forming those relationships ahead of time and investing in it is vital and important. And then maintaining ongoing communication as things change and evolve.
I'd agree entirely with Molly. I think that issue of having trust built up already, I think it would actually be very difficult to go into a project like this or many others and initiate those relationships. So it does take a lot of pre-work over previous projects over years. And I think queer history lends itself quite well to that, because I think some of the most innovative, interesting engaging work in queer history is being done outside the academy, and that for those of us invested in creative research and creative knowledge exchange, those kinds of collaborations become really, really obvious, and that distinction between academic and non-academic is diminished, at least. It still exists, but it's diminished, and it just seems, I guess it's one of those things that never occurred to me not to think about working with external partners. And again, I mean, citing Sean, who may still be in the room, I mean, there's just so many people doing amazing work through multiple organizations that we draw on, that we're inspired by, that really provide amazing examples about how to do this well. So we certainly draw on those people, those skill sets, those connections, and the inspiration of their work. So yeah, I think the two things I'd really come out of this saying are that for queer history, it's just an obvious necessity to have external collaborations for any kind of public facing work, and those collaborations have to be built on long-term trust.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it sounds really fascinating, like the diversity of activities that your students are doing is just so incredible, and just around like your research project, like Kath was saying. So I've noticed that it's 5:30. I don't know if our speakers want to want to switch their cameras off, and we can say thank you so much for your papers. I've got so many thoughts coming from this session myself. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have, because it was just such a great session, a really nice, and all the papers neatly fit in with each other so well. So thank you so much for participating. I hope to see you at our next pandemic, our next creative, oh, I was going to say pandemic.
Not pandemic, hopefully.
We're not there anymore. Our next workshop, which is going to be on the 3rd, which is going to be our 3rd workshop, is going to be on the 10th of November, and it's going to be at the same time, and it's going to be on the spaces of creativity. So it's looking at Indigenous histories, the use of mapping, and also walking as well, along with lots of other things. So I really hope that you can join us. There's a link at the top to our programme more widely. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. It's been really great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and especially our organizers. This is fabulous to be part of.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lucy's done all the hard work. I always say she's done all the links and everything like that. So
I don't know, actually.
much.
I don't know if we should. Well, we shouldn't really mention the links. Apparently, there were lots of people trapped in the.
No.
I don't know if I don't know what happened, but I think that's why we started off a little slowly.
People have got here, and we've also